Welcome to this journey where we dialogue with thought and heart leaders to share their reflections on human condition and how to improve them.
Today we have with us Luke Kemp. Luke is a senior research associate at the Center for Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. Luke looks at the past civilizational collapses and future climate changes and emerging technologies to guide policy in the present. He's an honorary lecturer in environmental policy at the Australian National University and was previously a senior economist at Vivid Economics.
Yeah. So, Luke, let's just deep dive into the conversation.
That's good.
Existential risk, the center that you're a senior research and you've been researching there for a long time. Are there any commonly accepted definitions of existential risk across the world?
Yeah, the most common definition comes from two papers done by a scholar called Nick Bostrom, who is a professor at the Future Humanity Institute at Oxford University. And in these two papers, he proposes a definition which is roughly the idea that existential risk is the extinction or end of life originating, Earth originating life, or its permanent and drastic curtailment. So essentially think of it this way, it's human extinction or something that will permanently and drastically curtail the potential of humankind. I think the latter part of that is actually quite difficult. It's really hard to know what is humanity's full potential, and there will be a huge kind of moral and philosophical debate about what exactly is our potential. So I actually think that the best and most sound scientific definition we can use for existential risk is just purely the extinction of humankind. We can then talk about things below that, like a global collapse or a global catastrophic risk, etc. But to me, the best and most coherent definition we can use for existential risk is just purely the extinction of humanity.
So I was thinking, are there any common myths around existential risk? In the sense, have you come across myths around mythology or myths around existential risk?
Yeah, so existential risk is largely born from myth. The original study we have of kind of human extinction largely comes from eschatology, which is essentially the study of the end of humanity in religion. So think of Revelations, for example, in the Bible, Ragnarok in Norse mythology. Now, these are quite different insofar as they don't actually talk about extinction per se. They don't think of humanity as a single kind of species. And they often think about potentially the end of humanity in its physical existence, but there's some kind of continuation in a spiritual or potentially post-material existence. What we have with existential risk is quite different insofar as we are thinking quite discreetly about extinction as a phenomenon that happens to species, and we don't really have any spiritual connotations to it. It's very much supposed to be a scientific endeavor. I think as it stands, there are not so much mythology as there are key flaws in the study. So one of the issues I come across quite frequently in the field is that when people say existential risk, they're basically talking about what we call a hazard. So a risk is usually broken up into three things: a vulnerability, your exposure, and the hazard. So think of it this way. If you have a tsunami, you have to be exposed to it. You have to actually be on the beach or basically in any zone where the tsunami will actually hit. If you're up in the mountains and you can't get hit, it's not a risk to you. There has to be the hazard itself. So in this case, that would be the actual wave, the tsunami. And there has to be a vulnerability. So if your settlements, for example, are on really high stilts and actually can't get by the tsunami, then obviously you're not vulnerable to it. On the other hand, if you have housing which is very easily destroyed, and potentially people who cannot easily recover from the losses of their livelihoods and homes, then you're highly vulnerable to that risk. Unfortunately, the way the study of existential risk is often done is just purely in terms of the hazards. So when people think of existential risk, they think things like killer robots, misaligned artificial intelligence, extreme climate change. And those are all important things to consider, but we also need to think about what is it as a global civilization that makes us vulnerable? And how are we exposing ourselves to these different risks and different hazards? And I think those elements are actually just as interesting, if not more so. And particularly when you look at them through the lens of coronavirus, for example, where I don't think it's just about the hazard. It's not just about that single strand of RNA which is constantly mutating and causing respiratory infections. It's also about the fact that it could spread so quickly because we've built up such tightly coupled, quick networks of transport and trade internationally. And we're also vulnerable because we've built up just-in-time supply chains, and we've built up also systems of injustice where people essentially have to go to work even when they're sick, because often they can't rely upon things like sick pay. And we're exposed because, unfortunately, we're creating ecosystems and habitats which are much more likely to lead to zoonotic infections because of things like biodiversity loss, wet markets, etc. So when you bring in the lens of vulnerability and exposure, you get a much richer appreciation of what is an existential risk and how exactly are we causing them.
So I think that was quite an elaborate and a very precise way in which you addressed it. A couple of things that stood out was the tight coupling and the contagion. You know, they're the two sides of the same coin in some sense. One gives you more efficiency, more stuff, and the other is a sort of a risk that you have. So in the recent past, before the COVID-19 or coronavirus, when you would get into different policymakers or business leaders, and you would go and present this argument to them, what are the kind of arguments that you would get against, against something like this when you're trying to posit this as a thing?
The typical one is that you'll lose efficiency. That the optimized, tightly coupled systems of supply, international trade, and transportation we have, they're efficient. They work very well from the standpoint of economic growth. These systems are optimized for that, and they're very good in the good times. But unfortunately, they're horrible when things go wrong, because often they can act to amplify a shock if it's large enough. And of course, because there's no buffering in the system, it means it's much more likely that if something does go wrong, you have less time to recuperate, and it's more likely the system's going to fall apart with you. So I think in many ways, what we're seeing right now is a good indication of potentially how fragile our modern hyper-connected world is. I definitely wouldn't call Corona an existential risk, as it seems highly, highly unlikely, unless there's some kind of really weird chain of cause and effect which leads to a nuclear war, that Corona will be in any way an existential risk, or even a global catastrophic risk. But what I do see this as is a kind of warning shot, potentially a dress rehearsal, where we're starting to see both how fragile our systems are, but also how effective our responses are. And in some ways we've performed quite well, and I think in many other ways we've been shown just how vulnerable we may be.
Interesting. If we look at how decisions have been made in the last 2 or 3 decades of this global growth story, globalization, we saw that there was a huge emphasis on the word efficiency that you mentioned, and the related word of something called as valuation of shares. And you found that never before in humanity you had this phenomena of valuing something of the future in a way which is budgeted in your current stock market price, but then you for the future risks in that sense, the way you and your research center describes it. Do you see the current crisis, as you said, as a dress rehearsal, would be good enough shock for people to relook at valuations, because those are the kind of things that drive business decisions and political decisions in a large sense?
I would hope so. It remains to be seen. I think most fundamental changes require some kind of large-scale shock. This is something that Milton Friedman, the quite famous neoliberal economist, reflected on quite some time ago, that you do require the most severe shocks to create the most fundamental change, and the change that occurs in those times is a reflection of what ideas are lying around. I would hope that Corona could potentially lead to a reevaluation, not just of how we value stocks and how we reflect risks, and particularly large-scale global risks, both the valuation of stocks as well as how institutional investors do their financing, but also a lot of other things, how we pay our most vulnerable frontline workers, things like universal healthcare, essentially a complete shift in the way we think about work as well. Unfortunately, it remains to be seen. I'm fairly skeptical that Corona will be a large enough shock to actually do that. What you want is a kind of what I call Goldilock shock, something that is large enough to create fundamental change, but not too large that it actually drastically and dramatically destroys your systems. I think we're unlikely to see this be a Goldilock that goes too far, but there's a good chance it may not go far enough. So it may not actually be strong enough to really create that kind of political shift. I think one thing that is useful is we actually do have the right ideas lying around now. So back in the 2008 global financial crisis, there wasn't as much of a civil society push for things like universal basic income. And yet now we already see Spain, for example, beginning to pioneer that as a response to Corona. So I'm skeptical that it will be strong enough, but on the bright side, at least the ideas are there. And if Corona doesn't act as the kind of shock or the stimulus to put these ideas into implementation, hopefully something else in the future may. Although, of course, it's a very sad state of affairs and we have to rely upon catastrophe to actually spur change. In terms of the valuation problem, I mean, you've pointed to it quite well, and there's also other problems, for example, that often what companies will do is share buybacks. They essentially buy their own stock to overvaluate their company. One of the key things that we've been working on at the Center for Study of Existential Risk is this idea, because a large amount of the stock market rests upon a couple of very large-scale institutional investors, things like both large-scale hedge funds and pensions, for example. And the funny thing is, when you actually look at these institutions, they have such a good reason to think in the long term and to really think about and take seriously global risks. So one of the big ones is that most of these firms were founded in perpetuity. They're actually supposed to exist for a very, very long period of time, if not perpetually. And because of that, they have to take global risk seriously, because a global risk, whether it's nuclear war or potentially a biological engineered pandemic, are some of the few shocks that could potentially end them, because they rely upon a healthy world and a healthy stock market and a healthy economy. And on top of that, we also know that when you look at previous divestment movements, so for example, both in climate change, but also in, for example, South African apartheid, there's very little reason to believe that divestment from any firm causing global risks will actually cause any kind of financial loss. All the studies done here or the vast majority of the studies done here in econometrics and finance show that a portfolio which is reflective of global risks and has a kind of corporate social responsibility and has environmental, social, and governance indicators built in is actually just as profitable, if not more profitable, than the same portfolio which also has things like tobacco, fossil fuels, etc., etc. So there's really no reason as to why institutional investors and investors more broadly should not be taking global risk seriously in the way they're allocating their finance and making decisions.
Interesting. One of the BBC article, the article that you wrote for the BBC, had this tone where you talk about what you deem as collapse, and one of the components that you mentioned was the continuation of political state or some kind of governance mechanism. If I just step back, then as long as we can go back to humanity, where we have started organizing ourselves, we always have this common decision-making body, elected, nominated, hierarchical, heredity, whatever we may call it. And then as we progressed in civilization, we had more and more concentration of power in the hands of few, in some sense. Do you see that this shock that we are going through right now will have enough voice for the people to be able to shake up the leadership to think in this direction?
So the way I like to think about collapse now is actually in two ways. First of all, I like to think of actually what I call a downfall, and that's the loss of the state. Most collapses do involve the loss of a central government system. So the actual system which is making most major decisions is collecting taxation and is essentially having some kind of monopoly on the means of violence over its population. And when you think of most cases which are considered collapses, so for example, the Maya or the Western Roman Empire, most involved a loss of government, whether in the case of the Maya it was a city-state or in the case of the Western Roman Empire, the actual empire itself. But most of them usually involved a political unit, the state being lost. And then from there, if things go really badly, if the loss of the state leads to a demographic collapse, so a large-scale loss of population and a loss of socio-economic complexity, then I think you can start to call it a true collapse. It needs to go beyond that loss of government to actually having a large-scale loss of socio-ecological capital and population. In terms of whether we can see this potentially leading to greater democratization, it's difficult to tell. Many downfalls in the past have been double-edged swords. They've often led to people and the masses leading better lives because often they've been freed from the yoke of very oppressive regimes. So if you were in a city-state in ancient Mesopotamia, say, for example, Babylon in the third dynasty of Ur, there's a better than average chance, or better than odds chance that you were a slave, most likely. And if you weren't a slave, you were essentially a wage slave. And the loss of that state and the ability to actually go beyond the walls often meant going back to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which is often more healthy and better for the people. What we see is historically over time, societies tend to become more unequal. They tend to have a greater concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, and hence also a greater concentration of oligarchy. More decision-making made by the few. Until you hit something called a great leveler. And this is a term from Walter Scheidel, and he did a large-scale economic history of the world and essentially found that inequality increases inexorably until you have one of four major violent events. And these are usually a mass mobilization war, a loss of the state, so a collapse or a downfall, a pandemic, or a revolution, a very bloody one at that. So there is definitely a historical basis and foundation for thinking that a pandemic could lead to both greater democracy and to greater redistribution of wealth and greater equality. I'm skeptical again as to whether Corona will be that powerful. When we look at when this has happened previously, it's usually been a pandemic in conjunction with something else. So the Spanish flu, for example, obviously occurred with World War I and World War II shortly afterwards. The Black Death was something that was disproportionate in terms of its virulence. We had in some places in Europe up to half the population wiped out, globally potentially up to a third. And Corona doesn't look like it's currently going to have that kind of hit and force to it. In many places, we're seeing a mortality rate of somewhere between 2 to 6%. But the latest evidence from Germany, from at least one study done in the North Rhine-Westphalia region, suggests that the mortality rate is probably close to 0.3% when you consider all people who have antibodies and all asymptomatic carriers. So Corona, while terrible and catastrophic in many ways potentially, is, I don't think, probably not strong enough to actually create that great level of effect, to actually really shift things towards greater democracy and equality. I hope so. That would be fantastic if that is the case, because I think to address most global risks, we need a more just world. But I'm skeptical as whether Corona will be strong enough. But I'd be happy to be proved wrong in this case.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I was trying to see that if I look at Corona and try to look at from a time scale perspective, then and if I were to formulate where we were, where we are, and where we want to go, then I can clearly see that there are no consensus amongst masses of where we were, where we are, and where we go. Because even today, when we look at the social media conversations that are happening, we can clearly see that they can be mapped or plotted across 4 or 5 categories. One is people hailing the current governments, right? So you have a huge army of people hailing and lauding their current government. Then there's another army of people who are opposing, who are talking, who are saying that the governments have not handled these crises in the right manner. The third category are people who are trying to connect it with spiritual myths or, the environmental activism, where they said this was likely to happen and this is a nature's call, this is a universal signal. There is a fourth category which is still undecided and they don't know what to do. So I see the masses are divided across these spectrum, and hence a coordinated response or even a voice to the leaders is challenging right now. Would you agree with that?
Roughly, yeah. So the way I like to think of this is there's a couple of key categories or dimensions, and across each one you have a really wide spectrum of ideological response here. of what people want, where they think we are, and where we should go. So when you look at this from an economic lens, you have, on the one hand, a very much leftist ideology, which is that we should start to renationalize major industries, particularly those who need to be bailed out. And those who need to be bailed out and aren't nationalized should be given really clear conditions, which are based upon the Green New Deal. So that should require things like a minimum wage, decarbonization and strong targets, greater policies towards both job security as well as sick pay, et cetera, et cetera. But the key idea being that this is an economic wake-up call, and we should use it to either bring large-scale corporations back under national control and, at the same time, force them towards conditions and terms which are more likely to help them lead decarbonization and efforts towards addressing major global problems. On the other hand, you have essentially people who are quite happy just to bail them out as is and want to see this being done as a kind of one-off stimulus before we're going back to business as usual, back to a kind of normal baseline. When you look across a different dimension, so let's take, for example, politics and democracy, you again see a similar spectrum. On the one hand, you have people thinking that we should have not just UBI, but potentially a greater move towards deliberative democracy in order to address these problems. On the other hand, you see both a lot of people believing that this should be the basis for new emergency powers to be enacted. And this is quite clear in places like Hungary, where Viktor Orban has essentially given himself a blank check to bypass parliament and put in place whatever legislative measures he sees fit to address corona. Essentially another step towards dictatorship. Similarly, in the US, we've seen, I believe it was a Supreme Court, and I think it was the Department of Justice actually putting forward suggestions for measures which would give new powers to law enforcement and potentially to regional courts, including being able to detain people without a basis or warrant. That hasn't been passed yet, of course. We've also had places like Texas and Ohio actually pass measures to ban most forms of abortion as kind of being non-essential. So what typically happens in most crises and shocks is that they're often used as the basis for what are called emergency powers or exceptional powers. But unfortunately, emergency powers tend to be sticky, and the exceptional becomes ordinary quite quickly. And we see this with things like in the US after 9/11, we had both the Patriot Act, which gave wide encompassing new powers to police, which essentially didn't get rolled back. And we also saw the setup of new measures for a much more empowered surveillance system. And this echoes through to today in what's called the PRISM project of the NSA, which is what Edward Snowden leaked over. So again, there's a spectrum where some people think this can lead to greater democracy. And on the other hand, we see really concrete moves by a number of states to essentially use both contact tracing as an excuse for the use of surveillance powers and use corona itself as an excuse for emergency powers. So again, corona could lead to a reinvigoration of democracy, or it could lead to another step down the slippery slope towards dictatorship.
Interesting.
And dictatorship of that.
Yeah, very interesting the way you frame this. So, are there any things different this time? Are you seeing any features which are very different from past crises or past collapse kind of thing?
It's a good question. I think what's actually more striking to me so far has been the similarities that despite our supreme technological advancement and all the differences in terms of global supply chains, politics, and technology, the responses of the modern age are not entirely incoherent from and incongruous from the responses even made during the Black Death, for example. They also had similar measures such as Costanza, trying to actually lock down and isolate entire areas of the population. You had pest houses, for example, which aren't so different to emergency hospitals being set up, where people are basically cordoned off to a large extent. Obviously, what we have now is a much more quick scientific response, and I think this is one of the greatest kind of demonstrations of our new capabilities, but also areas for hope and optimism, is the fact that we managed to actually provide a depiction of his genome quite quickly, and we're already starting to work on vaccines. And while a vaccine could take up to 18 months, that's still a damn sight quicker than how long it took for us to actually find ways of eradicating things like smallpox. So our responses are in many cases much quicker, but at the same time, the political flavour and many of the technical responses we're going to are not so different to what we had back during the Black Death. It's still things like cordoning off areas, locking down, trade restrictions, travel restrictions, etc., etc.
Interesting. If we look at existential risk as a phenomenon, and then we look at different units of our existence, you have individual, you have family, you have neighborhood, you have city, you have state, you have nation, you have international. At each level, people have a different feedback loop, and they keep working with it. Do you think that people's day-to-day treadmill that they have not been able to step back from is also an inhibiting factor for people to really make even sense of what is going on? In other words, do you think cognitive capabilities or in a certain direction is also a challenge in terms of managing such kind of crisis or an anticipation of one? Okay, so what I was saying is, if we look at our units of existence, then you have the individual, the family, the neighborhood, the city, the state, the nation, the international existence in some sense. And then people have different feedback loops to their behaviors, to their belief system.
Yeah.
And there would be certain inhibiting factors for people to really take this absolute priority and work at it. What are the things that you think are inhibiting factors for people to take this up as real priorities at the level of the centralized decision making and the individual decision making?
So I think the biggest factors are structural. They are at the centralized decision making level. It's hard to make addressing corona your overriding priority if you are living day to day, trying to get a paycheck, trying to pay rent, potentially taking care of multiple kids. So I think the major factors we have here are structural, that it's very difficult to expect people to be altruistic and to act appropriately during crisis if they're living on the margin and if they're oppressed in so many different kind of ways, particularly economically. There are, of course, individual ones as well. So these often come down to things like human biases. So people, for example, may not take the risk seriously, particularly if they've heard from different news sources or potentially loved ones in social circles that this is something that's only as bad as a common flu, basically. But even this often has a structural flavour and condition to it. We know that most of the common narratives and conspiracy theories that are being put forward to kind of disable or at the very least muddy the waters when it comes to the coronavirus response have often been perpetuated by key government actors, in particular Russia. So even misinformation is rarely this kind of like individual level phenomena. It's almost always done from a structural level, and it obviously percolates down to the individual. So I think most of the problems we see, even at the individual level, they have very important interrelationships to the global level. There are, of course, still some which are uniquely individual, and we will probably, I think, grapple with these increasingly in the future if the lockdown has to extend. It's very difficult for a social primate to stay locked up and not to have a large amount of social interaction. We know that, for example, lack of social interaction can lead to both lower life expectancy, higher rates of depression, etc., etc. So if you're actually expecting people to stay locked away and have limited contact with loved ones over for a long period of time, that's going to be very difficult just because it goes against our biological impulses. And of course, we do have a different world now. We have a digital world. We can do things like Zoom, Skype, WhatsApp, and a countless number of other platforms. But it's not quite the same as face-to-face contact. We know that the human brain hormonal system responds differently to face-to-face contact in comparison to talking. So there's definitely human nature may hinder the response in some way, but I think these shouldn't distract us from the largest disablers of collective response, and those are structural, those are governmental.
Yeah, so I remember your wonderful conversation almost a year back, and it sounds so coincidental with Robert Wright, because I think it was published on 30th of April, almost a year back.
Yeah.
And you guys touched upon a lot of interesting things about the collective response or the collective the responsibility of collective. What do you think centers like you, what can individuals like me and others who are interested in this subject could do to work with centers and researchers like you to ensure that this moves in that direction?
Work that actually preempts these kind of crises. We have to bear in mind that the chance of a zoonotic infection, an emerging zoonotic infection causing a global pandemic, was known for many years in advance. We have reports from the World Bank, I believe, back in 2014 or 2015, essentially saying that an emerging zoonotic infection is inevitable. We had plenty of warnings with SARS, avian flu, swine flu, etc. So I think people, if they can, trying to either support, whether that be financially or even in terms of their own career, the efforts of people working in biosecurity is quite vital. But honestly, I think the biggest thing people can do both right now as well as across global risks is organizing politically and helping each other. I think one of the brightest spots we have right now when it comes to Corona is the fact that even in lieu of government action, so even, for example, in the UK, when the government was essentially delaying its response, we saw a bottom-up collective self-organization to address the problem. We saw large cooperatives, for example, of young people volunteering to essentially get groceries and do shopping for elderly people so they could minimize their exposure, being the most vulnerable people to coronavirus. And we've also even seen people like lawyers, for example, doing pro bono work to help people who may be getting evicted from their house without due reason or process. So, and this is actually something you often see when it comes to large-scale catastrophe and crisis, is when the government doesn't act appropriately, often the people will. And I think that's the best thing that people can do right now when it comes to most global risks, is to try to keep the civil society network strong. So even in the case for downfall, even in the case where government isn't appropriately responding, we can have backup systems that will. But beyond this, as mentioned, we need to start politically organizing and mobilizing. So as I mentioned, there's a course across all these different areas, whether it's health, economy, or democracy, a spectrum. And where we have majority opinion and where we have the kind of strongest political will, of course, will fall towards that kind of response. So if we have the majority of the elites supporting the use of AI to enact a new kind of high-tech surveillance system in response to Corona, and we have very few people who are willing to democratically oppose them, that's probably what's going to happen. On the other hand, if we have a large popular uprising to use this as a chance to correct economic injustices, to have things like universal basic income, and they can push the right elites in the right way towards enabling that, then we'll have a totally different outcome. So much of this does eventually come down to political organization and mobilization. It's hard, it's difficult, it's messy. It's something I think a lot of scholars in my field don't want to deal with, but if you're looking towards saving the world, that's what you need to
do. In one of your essays that you've written, I think for the ABC, you mentioned that competition is both a mother and a reaper in some sense. And what I also see in the response that you mentioned, in bottom-up response that we're seeing, a lot of groups that are now self-organizing and trying to respond to different needs around. But there is also sort of competition between them. You know, the competition could be virtue signaling, the competition could be wanting more attention from the administration or more resources. Do you think that this is, first of all, it's natural, but then how do you are there any guidelines of how to organize them better so that they don't cancel each other, or they optimize, let me put it this way?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I'm still in the nascent stages of trying to both research how potentially competition drives many of the different forces that lead to downfall. And I'm still even more nascent in terms of thinking, how do you actually find a balance there? Because ultimately, I do think it is about a balance. I don't think you want to have a world that is deprived of competition entirely. But I think in most cases, whether it be between individuals, between states, or between classes, we have a system that is over-primed towards competition. And importantly, we have a system where the competition is becoming entirely asymmetrical. So we already do have a system of class warfare in most countries, and the problem is that the rich are winning by an incredibly large margin. Depending upon which study you look at, whether it's Oxfam or I think it was USB, generally speaking, the amount of wealth held by roughly the top 10% can be over a half of the global wealth. Or maybe over 30%, and more, sorry, it's more than what half of the world's population holds. And likewise, when we look at competition between states, again, most states do cooperate in many ways, whether it be, for example, trade, but in general, when it comes to things like high-level structural trade, as well as so what we actually choose to be doing free trade in, what we don't, as well when it comes to military spending, it's quite clear that the scales are still tipped towards competition. So ultimately, I think in most cases, it comes down to trying to find that balance. In terms of how we do that, to be honest, I'm really quite unsure at the moment. But I think in most cases, it's actually about changing the goals of the system. So if, for example, we had an international system which didn't take relative power so seriously and which had a greater value in the collective action over sovereignty, then we may easily see a system in which it's more likely to have cooperation as the kind of fundamental characteristic rather than military and economic competition. Likewise, if we had a strong system of redistribution at a national level where the goal of the good life for most people is not to have a kind of status competition that you win at all costs, but rather was to have, better connection with friends and family, to have better cultural and spiritual expression, etc. That itself would probably lead to more cooperation as well. So we know this from lots of studies of complex systems, but whatever the goal of the system is, that has a very strong influence and behavior upon how the system operates and behaves. So in many cases, I think it may be that change in the goals of our economies and our societies, and that'll filter through in terms of what kind of behaviors we exhibit. And unfortunately, right now, the goals in both cases are growth, and growth is generally underpinned by some kind of a competition imperative.
Interesting. Do you then foresee that there is a need for measuring some kind of adaptive competition and maladaptive competition in some sense?
Yeah, so my kind of easiest go-to response here would be using an alternative to GDP. And this has been on the cards for a very long period of time. Ecological economists like Herman Daly, for example, and Robert Costanza have been speaking about this since the 80s and 70s and earlier. And the general idea here is that GDP only looks at a very small subset of economic activity. So, for example, while it does account for things like funeral services required after a car accident or locks being placed in your house because you're fearful of crime, it doesn't account for a whole bunch of things which really matter and make life worthwhile. It doesn't account for example, unpaid work to raise children, not even the little things like actually seeing the smile of a loved one or a child. And it doesn't account for things like ecological capital. The fact that when I look outside and I see green spaces and trees, I'm less likely to have depression and more likely to have good mental health in general. That's something that's not reflected in the market price. So in those cases, the idea of a GDP alternative is usually taking in a whole bunch of additional indicators on top of GDP. So you still keep GDP kind of as a base of sorts, but you add in things like ecological capital. You add in things like measurements of happiness. You add in things like measurements of social capital. How much do people in a community trust each other? And when you take all of that into account, it gives a very different picture of what is progress. And that gives a more holistic idea of how exactly should we try to grow our societies. And it tends to, once again, lead to different behaviors, not ones which are predisposed towards competition and ruthless mentalities, but instead towards empathy and altruism. It also gives a very different indication of where countries stand right now. So I mentioned Robert Costanza earlier, and he and a number of other scholars, including Ida Kubiszewski, did a study, I think around about 5 years ago, where they looked at, if you use, I believe it was the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is one of the typical alternatives to GDP we have. If you use that and actually measure countries' performance over time, you find that the key countries such as the US have actually plateaued ever since the 1970s and actually potentially gone down a little bit. Even though GDP has increased drastically, it's come at the cost of ecological capital, it's come at the cost of social capital, trust amongst communities, and it's come at the cost of both the economic precarity and the happiness of its citizens. So it's really a big question of, has that been worthwhile? You've grown the pie, but it hasn't been shared better, and it's led to essentially everyone being hungrier. So I think that a huge amount of this does come down to simply changing the way that we measure things, changing what we're measuring, and that in turn changes what we think of and conceive of as the good life.
Yeah, great. As you were speaking, Luke, I was thinking, are there also challenges around the measurability of things and the consensus around it? And add to it the political will, which is currently polarized in so many ways.
Of course, yeah. I mean, there's always going to be a battle and debate of measurement, because measurement matters. What we measure, we tend to act upon. But of course, as we know, not everything that can be measured matters. Not everything that matters can be measured. There have been criticisms of some of the alternative GDP. Khan has had a gross national happiness measurement, and that's been criticized for a number of different reasons. One of them is the fact that a lot of the different areas it's trying to measure are difficult to measure. It's relying often upon sparse data and difficult methodologies. But in most of these cases, we have the same thing with GDP as well. Even with GDP, we often don't know what exactly the growth in GDP was until a number of months afterwards. It's actually quite difficult to get a really complete, clear, and comprehensive snapshot of an economy. And it's less about, can we get a perfect measurement, and more about, can we get a measurement that is better than what we currently have? And given the woes and pitfalls of GDP, that is surely true. Even if there are areas in the genuine progress indicator or other GDP alternatives which are difficult to measure or underpinned by more obscure methodologies, ultimately that measurement is still going to be more comprehensive and a genuinely better measurement than GDP will be. So we need to be careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Interesting. I remember one of the conversation that you were having with Robert Wright. Towards the end, you mentioned I think Harvard biologist E O Wilson, and you mentioned, and you quote that we are with Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions and godlike technology. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it captures our milieu quite well. So the quote from E O Wilson is roughly along the lines of that we have brains that are Paleolithic, institutions which are medieval, and technologies which are godlike. I don't think our technologies are entirely godlike yet. There's still a long way to go. But that's the risk, right? If we actually start to develop godlike technologies and we still have medieval institutions, and we still have Paleolithic brains in many ways, then that can cause huge problems, and potentially ones which could eventually lead to our extinction. And this is something we already see very clearly when it comes to nuclear weapons. The fact that we created an ability to actually split the atom and release an incredible, fantastic amount of energy. And what we did was immediately both weaponize it and then start to stockpile it between two powers in a Mexican standoff that could have led to Armageddon. Surely something is wrong, both from an institutional as well as a kind of biological level there. And I think this is underpinning most of our problems when it comes to humanity, that we're still in many ways an ice age hunter who is clever but seldom wise. And that's a good quote from Robert Wright. And I think that's often our problem, is that we're very clever. We have amazing abilities to technologically and technically circumvent different problems, but we still haven't solved many of the most basic kind of political and institutional problems. And I think this is one of our problems, actually. Sorry, I said problems way too many times there, but this is one of the overarching dilemmas, is that whenever we face a new problem, we think about the technological means to solve it. And generally speaking, the technological solution often creates new problems. Instead, we should often be taking a step back and thinking, what are the political and institutional fixes here? And I do hope this is something we start to do both with Corona, but also with future crises as well, that we don't automatically think, how can we get a vaccine out quicker, although that is important. We also think about what were the institutional and economic setups and structures which actually made us vulnerable to this in the first place. And then we fix those. That's much more difficult because politics, unfortunately, is often much more difficult than science. But it's in many ways something that's actually more important.
Interesting. So would you then be siding with Joseph Tainter when he mentions the diminishing return on complexity? Do you think there is a way around particular thesis that he has?
I think there's multiple ways around it. It's a difficult thesis to grapple with sometimes, because Tainter doesn't clearly define what exactly complexity is, and this has often led to people using it in different ways and trying to define it and measure it in different ways as well. I think, and there's also different reasons as to why you reach this declining, diminishing returns of complexity. Is it because you eventually run out of new innovations which are going to kind of push the paradigm forward? I think a lot of it actually does come down to inequality. This is a kind of working underlying hypothesis of mine. But when I look at something like climate change, I think this is a really good example of where we potentially reach diminishing returns of complexity, where if I look at Australia, for example, an ideal policy response to climate change is actually a fairly simple one. It would be built upon a couple of key policies, both standards to encourage energy efficiency, as well as a very strong carbon price, and a policy of government subsidization for new emerging technologies which are likely to replace fossil fuels, particularly in difficult to decarbonize areas. It's actually a fairly simple policy suite, but instead in Australia what we have is an incredibly Byzantine complex of different policies which have often been chop-changed. Our emissions are still going up. We are still incredibly, politics is down to lobbying, it's down to political economy. And I think often when we think about diminishing returns and complexity, this is often the problem we're thinking. And that eventually leads, but not actually addressing the underlying problem. And that leads to a system where we still have the problems continuing unabated, but we also have all this additional institutional clutter on top of it. And that in itself is both a problem of politics and it's a problem of inequality as well. There is a political fix here, and it's about making sure that you address problems when they arise, rather than trying to find sessions to lobbyists which essentially mask the problem but don't address it. But that often requires a fundamental rethink of how we do democracy and how we do politics. There's potentially more technocratic fixes. So if you think you're hitting a point of diminishing returns in technology, potentially you can find a new area of technological development which is no longer finding those diminishing returns. So I think there's both technological means to potentially get past Tainter's dilemma, and there's also political ones. But I myself am a bigger believer of the political ones. And ultimately, this all depends upon why are we reaching diminishing returns complexity. And I think that's still a fairly large unknown.
Yeah. So maybe we can reframe it as diminishing return on current politics.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, a lot of it's about diminishing returns on your, and this sounds very kind of economisty and politics in many ways is a negotiation about how we use and create new surplus capital.
Interesting. So towards the end, Luke, how do you manage your daily inner life? And when you're swamped by so much of data, so much of research, interdisciplinariness, and the headwinds that you face every day?
I mean, first of all, I definitely wouldn't use myself as a paragon of either productivity nor of equilibrium or anything like that. But there are certain things I do find to be very helpful on a personal level. One is meditation. I do try to meditate at least an hour a day. I've been going to a number of Vipassana retreats over the last 2 years, and I find that's incredibly helpful, both in terms of exploring your inner self, your kind of, not really quite the self, but exploring your inner experience and exploring the nature of consciousness, but also just having a clearer equilibrium when it comes to everyday life, when it comes to all the challenges you face, whether it be in work or personal relationships. I also find just simply trying to think about your consumption of information as a diet and basically practice clean eating. So in general, I always try to read much more, at the very least twice or 3 times more from books than what I take in from things like online media articles, Twitter, etc., etc. Books have a really good natural selection process behind them. If someone's actually going to spend the time and effort to both write, market, and publicize a book, it usually means that much more greater amount of thought and analysis has gone into that book. In comparison, if someone puts a blog, it can often be reflective of a couple of hours' work with very little full thought going into it. So books by nature are usually much more robust material. And on top of that, you often have what's called the Lindy effect. And that's the idea that something that's been around for a longer period of time is more likely to be around for a longer period of time. So we still read the works of Seneca, the ancient Roman philosopher, and it's likely in 1,000 years, if we're still around, we still will. While a book that's only been out for a year or a couple of weeks, who knows, it may not be read in a year's time. So often trying to rely upon the classics is a good selection process as well. But I think the biggest one is just trying to keep a healthy media diet, focus upon the things that really matter, like books.
That's wonderful, Luke. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, and we'll definitely soon connect once again for more such insights.
Sounds good. It was a delight talking to you.